Said that you were very, very inspired by your late grandfather, Dr. Moossa Bral. Can you let us know more about?
Yeah, thank you for asking. My paternal grandfather, Moossa, he was a pharmacist by trade, but became the Jewish representative in parliament and the only Jew at his time because of strict Jewish quotas. So he was the representative to the entire Jewish community. And even with the attention that came with being a black sheep, he was unencumbered by the arbitrary limitations imposed on him because of his identity. One of the first things that he did when he entered office was change the law that required all members of parliament to take the oath of office on the Quran to allow all members to take the oath on their holy book of choice. And it was the service of this small but mighty Iranian Jew like myself that was ultimately rewarded by the king, the Shah, Mohammad Reza, with the royal medal.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Good night also. And this is Dr. Shubda Chaudhary and it is Middle East Insights platform. Today we are going to talk about the impact of Trump-Bibi era right now on Israel-Palestine and what's going to happen. And for that, we have a very, very esteemed speaker with us. But before I introduce, you have to like and subscribe. Now we carry on. So Daniel Bral is a first-generation Iranian American writer on Israel, the conflict, and coexistence. He serves as the Director of Education and Partnerships at Project Shema and is also a civil rights attorney at California Democratic Party delegate. No one will have a look at him and say that he is an attorney and he's also a director because he looks very young. Take it as a compliment. And Daniel received his bachelor's degree from UCLA. All of you should know where UCLA is. It's very famous. And his JD from Loyola Law School, where he served as executive editor of Loyola's International and Comparative Law Review. Inspired by his late grandfather, Dr. Moossa Bral, who was the sole Jewish member of the parliament in pre-revolution Iran at the time, Daniel is a devoted Jewish community leader and peace builder. He also writes in Los Angeles Times, Haaretz, and other publications. So welcome so much to you, Daniel. And
thank you, Dr. Shubda. I'm not so esteemed, and I want to keep expectations. I'm not an expert either, but I'm excited to be here and have fun and answer questions. And I'm really grateful for being invited here. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And we can pass you as a high school student anytime.
I'd much rather be in high school. Than where I am now.
Okay. So the first question that I want to ask you is, yesterday Time asked Trump, does he trust Netanyahu? And he said he trusts no one. How do you understand it?
I love that answer. And I do not love Donald Trump. Just to make that abundantly clear. Well, let's think about it first vis-a-vis Benjamin Netanyahu. He has every right to not trust him. I mean, Benjamin Netanyahu has proven time and time again throughout his career that he's one of the most untrustworthy politicians there are. So he hasn't earned the benefit of the doubt. So I'm happy that Trump has experience understanding who he is based on his 4 years of working with him and is approaching his second term and this relationship with a heavy dose of skepticism and his guard up, I'm not going to place so much faith and credit into Donald Trump because people don't trust him either. So it's kind of two peas in a pod between Donald Trump and Benjamin Netanyahu.
So, but at the same time, if we look back into the first presidency, and I'm sorry to know that there's a second presidency, but during his first presidency, Trump did a couple of things which were very pro-Israel. At the same time, we are differentiating between the Israeli state and the Israeli civilians.
Yes.
So, one was shifting the embassy of US to Jerusalem, then was starting the entire Abraham Accords. I do understand that at that point of time, Trump had a lot of pressure of the Jewish lobby and Christian evangelicals on him. How do you think he's going to deal with the Israel-Gaza ceasefire, if there's any?
So I first want to touch on something you mentioned in your question. You said the word pro-Israel. That begs the question of what does it even mean to be pro-Israel? And that's something that's very important to me that I've written about because I don't necessarily take for face value what he did in isolation or in totality to be pro-Israel. You talked about moving the embassy and the Abraham Accords. In isolation, those are great things. And it was very popular amongst most Israelis. And the Abraham Accords, don't get me wrong, fantastic. But moving the embassy was supposed to be part of final status negotiations, something that the US could use as leverage in hopes that Israel would come to the negotiating table at some point and to use in negotiations between Israelis and Palestinians for a two-state solution, right? So doing that removes something really important and coveted that Israelis wanted from the negotiating table and just handed it to them without really getting anything in return or indirectly for Palestinians. And that's kind of the same thing for the Abraham Accords. Fantastic. I'm so happy that Israel is being integrated into the region and it's important and it's establishing neighborly relations with people in the region. But also that could have been leveraged to enhance the situation between Israelis and Palestinians and do more for Palestinians. But it really didn't do anything for them whatsoever. And for me, the way I understand what it means to be pro-Israel is it's interconnected with what is pro-Palestine because their two fates are intertwined. There is no salvation for Israelis without salvation for Palestinians. And their securities are connected too. We clearly see that now, especially post-October 7th. So if, they could have leveraged those two signature achievements with some movement on the Palestine front, that would have been wonderful. And to me, that would have been the most pro-Israel thing Donald Trump and Joe Biden could have done.
So there was recently Joe Biden coming out of a bookshop taking Rashid Khalidi's book, 100 Years War in Israel, on Palestine, sorry. And he, I don't know if it was a candid moment or it was planted, but as an American citizen, how do you scrutinize Biden's presidency?
Domestically, I think he was one of the most successful domestic presidents in generations. I mean, with all of his signature achievements, including infrastructure law, something that many presidents promised, including Donald Trump, for their presidency and didn't even achieve. On foreign policy, specifically the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I think he was a failure. And it pains me to say that because I really do like Joe Biden, but I think he didn't do enough throughout the course of the war to really put his imprint on it in a more productive and constructive way. I was very happy to see him immediately rush to Israel's side in the aftermath of 10/7. I wouldn't want that to change because he showed empathy with Israelis and he feels a visceral connection to the Israeli people. He referred to himself as a Zionist. So that is affirming for so many Jewish people and non-Jewish people too, who feel some sort of affinity to Israel and the Israeli people, not necessarily the government. But after that, and he made a very poignant warning to Israel when he went there in the aftermath of 10/7 and said, don't make the same mistakes that we made in Iraq. So he was aware of the possibility of those mistakes being made But as president of the United States, with all the power that he had at his toolbox, he didn't do anything to make sure that the conflict didn't go in the wrong direction. And so we see that there has been no ceasefire under his watch, that there has been so much death and destruction in Gaza, which doesn't serve Israel either, right? So I think just basically looking at that, it's hard to say that he is leaving a positive legacy with respect to the Middle East after these 4 years in office.
That is something which I also, find it very difficult, because when he spoke recently at the Rose Garden, he talked about the Israel-Lebanon ceasefire.
Mhm.
And then recently, when he talked about the fall of the Assad regime,
Mhm.
it felt as if he's taking the entire credit of it.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that was something which was a very jaundiced point of view. There are still 900 American troops in Syria.
Yeah, it's a very political answer, and political self-interested point of view. And I want to say, you know, first and foremost, all credit lies with the Syrian people for what they did and for the reality that we see ourselves in now. I do want to give some credit, though, not credit, but understand the dominoes that also helped result in this new reality. And that is also Israel and its decimation of Hezbollah, Iran being significantly weakened, its axis of resistance being significantly weakened, and then obviously Russia being preoccupied with the war in Ukraine. So I think all of these things contributed to the circumstances that allowed for al-Assad to have lost his power. But I don't think it's fair to say or remove the spotlight from the Syrian people themselves, who were responsible first and foremost for their newfound liberation.
Yeah, and it was a historic opportunity before, US started striking the ISIS bases, and Israel started bombing, took over Golan Heights, started bombing Latakia and Tartus, and got into, it's very close to Damascus as of now, we speak.
Mm.
And somehow I believe that this was not coincidental. The entire we'll never come to know what exactly the political moves were, but it doesn't seem coincidental from the point of view that 26th November this is done, the ceasefire, and 27th HTS comes.
Yeah, well, I think that kind of goes back to what I said before about how, there were many elements to the fruitful collapse of Assad's regime. One of them being the ceasefire in Hezbollah and them striking HTS, if you will, while the iron was hot. They realized, okay, Hezbollah is no longer a capable fighting force at the moment. Their weapons have been fairly destroyed. Their rank and file has been severely diminished. Their leadership has been decapitated. So this is actually a perfect moment for us to accelerate our ambitions for revolution and taking over. So we see now what Israel is doing in Syria, and begs the question: is this the most? Is this the smartest way to go about extending a hand to your neighbor? Now, I understand the position that Israel is also in, because everything Israel does is through the prism of security. We have to take care, Israelis are thinking, we have to take care of our own people first and protect our own safety. And we can't trust and place our faith in the hopes that these new leaders in Syria, who used to be members of Al-Qaeda, or at least Jalani was, will have our best interests at heart. So I understand the perspective of needing to destroy chemical weapons facilities and things of that nature. But I don't necessarily think it was a wise decision, to say the least, to expand its buffer zone beyond the Golan Heights, because the Golan Heights itself is supposed to be a buffer zone. Yeah. So it just, and it's not a really, it doesn't really send a good signal for the Syrian people, but it also doesn't send the best message to the international community, especially Israel has taken a huge hit to its image, and it seems like they're just trying to exploit a situation for their benefit. And I don't think that's necessarily advantageous either.
And in the like giving a benefit of doubt to Netanyahu, though he just spoke just after Assad regime fell, he spoke in Hebrew.
Yeah.
And he said that he's ready to give an olive branch to Druze, Ismailis, and Alawites, and all the Muslims who want to be at peace with Israel. He never used the word Syrian.
He did not?
Yeah, he did not use the word Syrian. The second thing, which though the opposition fighters said that after liberating Syria, we will also go to Jerusalem and then we'll go to Mecca. That kind of rhetoric is also there from the HTS and the other umbrella groups, which will make anyone, any Machiavellian prime minister or president quite sensitive.
Yeah, and that's a good point. And I saw that, and that's why I understand Israel's perspective of wanting to preemptively destroy any weapons that could get in the wrong hands based on that history and that rhetoric that you just mentioned. So I understand the position of the IDF and Prime Minister Netanyahu of wanting to be extra cautious given the changing dynamics in Syria, which is Israel's neighbor, and Israel is also preoccupied with other neighbors, of course, so it's spread thin. I just hope it's not, it doesn't sour the potential of forming a relationship with these new leaders in Syria in hopes of achieving peace, as distant as that may seem or unlikely as it may seem right now. One could always hope that that is the path that both people will go down.
Yeah, we never know, because Gilani as such said that his war was against Iran, Hezbollah. He did not mention the Israeli strikes even once. And the first time when the interim Prime Minister Mohammed Bashir gave an address, there was the Syrian flag, the revolutionary flag, along with the Islamic flag. And then there was a lot of hullabaloo. And then the next time he gave an address, there was only the Syrian flag. And the most interesting thing is that Assad, after all of that, has rushed to Russia. And he wants to go back to his profession of ophthalmology and start his own charity work in Russia, Dubai, and other places. While his sister-in-law, Maher al-Assad's wife, basically mentioned that she's quite offended that Bashar did not tell before fleeing away. And there are some rumors that Maher al-Assad has been caught in Iraq.
Yeah, I heard that too. I also heard that Assad is promising to start a podcast. I didn't know if that was a joke or not, but I read that a couple of different places from otherwise serious journalists. So I thought that was, on one hand, hilarious, and also just so comedically perfect.
It doesn't. Maybe he feels that for his own redemption and catharsis. You never know. Maybe he felt let down by the media in terms of his image, international image.
I certainly don't wish him the best.
Yeah, me too. And the question, Shrishti, one of our students, she's asking that Trump said that he would stop the ongoing wars the very first day of his second term. So what all is happening on 20th January, I don't know. But if that really comes to pass, that would be great news. But at the same time, it would hurt US's economy, which is significantly boosted by wars. Like the military state complex, industrial complex, and deep state and all of it.
That is very true. The U.S. does benefit. And one thing a lot of people don't understand, especially here in America, is how, especially when we think about the weapons that we're giving to, for example, Ukraine, sometimes people look at it as through the prism of charity, but it actually benefits the U.S. economy too. And war is profitable. But I want to put that aside for a sec, park that, and talk about the hope that the war will end between Israel and Hamas on January 20th, hopefully sooner than that, because there are hostages who from reports, half of them are hopefully alive. Hopefully, all of them are. But then also innocent Palestinian lives are still at stake. And I do think, and I'm hopeful that the war will end very soon. I mean, there are also reports that Biden's team has been in talks with Trump's team and working together to bring about an end to this war. And also, Qatar has reemerged a as a negotiator on behalf of Hamas. So I'm hoping that the war will end. I was always cynical and always believed that Netanyahu didn't want to end the war during Biden's presidency so as to not give him that political victory, and was waiting for Trump to win. And so I think we'll see that happen. But I'm also even skeptical that that is such a guarantee, because Netanyahu is politically motivated. He's an extremely selfish and self-interested individual. And so he doesn't want to do anything that would in any way harm his political career. And, you know, maybe he's been given, he has more latitude to now act on this front because, you know, he could say, well, I was successful in Lebanon and, you know, look at what's happening in Syria. This is all a result of our action. So he may have more wiggle room to achieve a ceasefire in Gaza from his more, I mean, it's crazy to say his more rightward coalition partners like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. But Netanyahu won't do anything that will jeopardize his political stability. So I'm not going to say I'm hopeful, but I think if anyone can actually pressure him to end this war, I do think that would be Donald Trump. I wish it was Joe Biden, but here we are.
That actually makes a lot of sense, because I heard a rhetoric. There was one particular meme that went viral, which was like, are the hostages in Damascus? You know, like a kind of dark humor. And the second was also about Trump calling Netanyahu and saying that there shouldn't be any ceasefire talks. But as far as I have the information, as of now, Hamas has given a list of points to Egypt, which means how Israel should withdraw in phases from Gaza, how the Palestinian prisoners have to be let go of, then the hostage exchange will take place, and the bases that Israel has within Gaza, all of that has happened, and supposedly Egypt has forwarded it to Israel, to Tel Aviv. Now, how much of that is true, we don't know. And how much of that is a Chinese whisper, we don't know. But the fact that really something which has disturbed me, and you can answer this because you have also seen the student protests happening in US. And Trump said that he will sanction against any university where any kind of protest movements takes place now, or hate speech takes place now. Something which I don't understand is, and I'm coming completely from a point of ignorance, when Vietnam War took place, even though at that point we didn't have social media and so much of technology, but a lot of Americans came out and protested. Today they are as famous as Noam Chomsky and others. But I don't understand that, and there were student protests even at that point of time. And students were blamed even at that point of time. But what I don't understand is today we have more of social media. We are consuming the ethnic cleansing, genocide, whatever we call it, on a daily basis. But it has reached our phones and always there. But what I don't understand is, why is there still a debate about it?
Debate about what?
Like in terms of banning protest movements in the university, or Americans together not coming in protests like it's seen in UK and other European countries for Palestine.
You know, this is a really important but difficult question. And I want to say, first and foremost, as someone who was a civil rights attorney, and also now whose work is so centered around dialogue between not just intracommunal Jewish to Jewish, but especially, Jewish, Muslim, or Israeli-Palestinian, I believe in the importance of dialogue and freedom of expression. So I do not favor punishing or in any way going after a nonviolent protest. I believe that we need to give, even though I may not agree with every single thing said, every approach taken in the pro-Palestine protest. Nope, not everyone agrees with everything that they see in there. Yeah. I believe in their right to protest. And I think, I always say dialogue, there's no such thing as 100% ideological harmony, right? You're never going to agree with anyone on everything they say and do. But we have to give space for people to air out their grievances. And of course, people are not happy with what they see happening in Gaza, and they're going to protest about that. That doesn't mean that we shouldn't speak out about the serious anti-Semitism that we do see in some of these protests, or not just in protests, but generally speaking, post-October 7th, because it is an issue, point blank, period. And so is Islamophobia, of course. But that does not mean that we should employ a heavy hand and quash all forms of protest, because what we need is to actually bring communities together and find a way to have conversations with one another. And in one of the pieces I wrote for the LA Times was about how, based on the work that I do, my firsthand experience having conversations with people. And, for me, it's personal. I talk about how Muslim-Jewish coexistence is personal to me, even though I'm not naive about its challenges, because of my grandfather serving as a member of parliament as a second-class citizen in a Muslim-majority country. I take that seriously. And I've seen our ability and people's interest to have conversations, but they just don't know where to start, what to say, or if the other side wants to engage with them either. But you talk about media, and the media does such a good job of magnifying the extremes on both sides, which gives off this false impression of unbridgeable division, or that this conflict is beyond resolution. And that's not true. Of course, there are extremes on both sides who harbor hatred and don't want to engage in dialogue and intend to do malice. But that's human nature, that's natural. But we shouldn't make them the moral of the story. We should be able to, approach people, have conversations, be curious, ask them what is motivating them, what's driving them to engage in the protest that they're doing. Do they have family on the ground? Are they personally impacted? You share your story as well, and why this means so much to you, why you feel a certain type of way if you're Jewish or pro-Israel, and you see these protests and some of the things that are being expressed there, and how that may cause harm to you, your family, and the people that you care about. But how can we find common ground? And instead of punishing the protest, because that also, I think, would have an unintended negative consequence of making it seem that Jewish people are behind this, which would feed horrible anti-Semitic stereotypes. Yes. I wouldn't want that. So I don't think that is a wise decision.
Yes, it is. In fact, there was a particular, which really disturbed me, was a particular author. Let me tell you his name. He wrote this book recently, I think 2 months back. His name is Tablet Shattered was the book.
Joshua Leifer.
Yeah, Joshua Leifer. And there was a book launch or a book discussion in a bookshop in Brooklyn.
Correct.
And just half an hour or 1 hour before, it was cancelled. And that, I felt, was not the correct way to go around it. Without even reading his book, he should, obviously when he's discussing his book, not everyone has read it. But everyone can ask him questions and he can answer.
Yeah, and this is a serious problem. I talked about anti-Semitism and how it's a serious issue. I mean, it's always been a serious issue. It's never gone away. It's always been lurking in the shadows. But post 10/7, it's now arguably mainstream. But it's taken a new form and shifted into this, we're not criticizing Jews, or we're not attacking Jews, we're not anti-Semites, we just don't like Zionists. And that is a very clever way of sidestepping that otherwise obvious bigotry of anti-Semitism. Because what happened with this author, for example, Joshua, and what is happening to so many Jews who may or may not identify as Zionists, it's actually not necessarily how they identify, it's the perception that non-Jews have about their relationship to Israel. And so that in itself is also a problem. But fundamentally, there is an issue when you are imposing litmus tests on people, but also specifically in this case against Jews, right? You're dividing Jews between good Jews and bad Jews. The good Jews who reject Israel or anything to do with Israel, and the bad Jews who identify as Zionists. And I want to get to that, but Jews who have an ostensible relationship with Israel. And that's extremely problematic, and I would say anti-Semitic, because you are effectively targeting and isolating and excluding. And isolation and exclusion leads to dehumanization and demonization, which historically ultimately leads to violence. You are doing that to a majority of Jewish people. And that is problematic, irrespective of their actual views or having conversations with them. And to get back to Zionism, I mean, Dr. Shabda, I'm sure you are well aware of this. You're a smart person. I can venture that 90% of the people who say they are anti-Zionist or who are imposing these litmus tests or engaging in these boycotts and shutting down these events don't even know what Zionism means. Now, Zionism may mean a million different things to a million different people, but from the Jewish perspective, and it should only be Jews who are able to identify, who are able to name and define their own identity, just like no other community should be able to speak over how others identify, right? So for Jews, Zionism is just the feeling, the right to and need for national self-determination in some portion of our ancestral homeland after being forcibly expelled from there and the millennia of persecution that we face. Or to put it more simply, our belief in Israel's right to exist amongst the community of nations. And granted, not every Jew identifies as a Zionist, and their views should be heard and respected as well. And we also have to be mindful of what Zionism means and has meant to Palestinians. Their views and their lived experience should also be respected.
Yeah.
And having said that, we need to understand, though, what Zionism means to most Jews and that historical connection. Another thing that is corroding our conversations and, specifically manifesting in what we saw with the cancellation of the book club with Joshua, the book event. Too many people conflate Zionism with Israeli government policy. Those are two distinguishable things. Zionism was strictly a movement for national self-determination in some portion of the Jewish people's ancestral homeland. That manifested in 1948. So it is arguably a moot point. Israeli government policy, on the other hand, is not the same thing. And so people often use Zionism as a stand-in term for every Israeli government policy that they find abhorrent or they disagree with, whatever the case may be. But we need to separate the two things, because when you are attacking Zionists, it's oftentimes seen as an attack on Jews and Jewish identity. Whereas if you focus your criticism on government policy, that is fair game, and government policy can change. So I wish people would direct their criticism in that direction.
Yeah, that exactly is, but, it also, when Netanyahu comes and says that the ICC warrants against him is like the Dreyfus affair of 1894.
Right, which is ridiculous.
Yes. Yeah, it's like completely two different, he's putting himself at the level of Dreyfus, which is...
Right, it's just abject, gaslighting.
Yeah, he's gaslighting. I'm like, how can you... But anyway, but the point is that one thing which, and I'll come to the student questions, one thing which is not even highlighted at this point of time, that Netanyahu is not just facing battles on the foreign policy front, also on the domestic politics front. For example, the first woman attorney general of Israel, she is the one, Gali Bahar of Miara.
Hmm.
She is the Attorney General who is scrutinizing the corruption case.
Hmm.
And Ben Gavir has been very anti her. There's massive kind of rhetoric against her.
Hmm.
And she's having a tough time, but she's not, because the case opened from what, 2016, 2019, and this is
Yes,
2024.
and it took steam in 2019, and it was
Yeah.
actually brought about by Netanyahu's own appointed Attorney General Mendelblit.
Yes, yes. And that also, I don't know what was the logic of appointing the woman. I'm not trying to go against it. I'm trying to understand their mind game of maybe using a scapegoat in this process. Like, were they using a scapegoat in the name of her to face all the acrimony because no other one wanted to take the cause?
Hmm.
So I don't know, but she's strong and I really admire her. She was also against the
Yeah,
spyware and all of it.
I
So
have deep admiration and respect for her and sympathy for the position that she's in. Look,
yeah,
every authoritarian finds a scapegoat, and or basically anybody who's standing up to the would-be dictator, and in that case, that's her.
yeah,
She is kind of um, the what's the word I'm looking for? She's the stopgap from a lot of horrible things happening, and I don't know. I give more power to her.
yeah,
I see the opposition coming into her defense, um, not consistently, in my opinion. I wish they would do so more forcefully in all areas. You know, she's being targeted on many issues, not just when it comes to Netanyahu's
yeah,
corruption case, on several issues. And so I wish there was a more harmonious and vociferous defense of her and the work that she's doing, because
yeah,
she is standing up to the worst impulses of the current Israeli government.
yeah. Shalaka is asking this question that with Netanyahu's far-right coalition openly advocating for West Bank, Judea, Samaria annexation and settlement
Mm-hmm.
expansion, has Israel completely abandoned even the pretense of following the two-state solution?
Oh, 100%. Thank you for the question,
Mm.
Shalaka. I mean, without a doubt, they make no qualms about it. They're completely explicit in saying, and Netanyahu has said, and Ben Gavir and Smotrich have said, there will be no two-state solution. There will be no Palestinian state on my watch. So they're not hiding the ball here. They want, especially Ben Gavir and Smotrich, want to annex the West Bank. Um, and they're very transparent about it. They talked about their plans to do so. I think Smotrich just gave a press conference recently about it and about his plan to do that, especially with an incoming Trump administration. So that is the major concern in a second Trump administration, whether he or other international actors like the Saudis of Emirates, like the Emirates did the first go round when Israel or Netanyahu wanted to annex the West Bank, will prevent that from happening. I can't say I'm very confident, but that would just be a fatal decision.
No, the entire pretense of a two-state solution is long gone. It was dead before
Mm-hmm.
13th September 1993.
I, you know, I slightly disagree with that. I think there was hope for it with Barak and especially Olmert.
Hmm.
So I want to say the pretense of it was killed once Bibi came back into office.
Yeah, and
And I'm
that's
not even,
2009,
I'm
right?
not, yeah, and I'm not even including the Carry Peace Initiative in 2014, if I'm not mistaken, under Obama's presidency, because I don't know if that was ever um, taken about in good faith. So I do think, up until 2009, there was good faith effort by the Israelis to engage in peace negotiations. But I think once Netanyahu came back into power, that went out the window.
She's also asking that with the rise of digital open source information, OSINT, where global audiences can witness events in real time, including the genocide in Palestine, How do you envision the possibility of truth and reconciliation, a process often rooted in forgiveness, when the gravity of the crimes is so visible, undeniable, and overwhelming?
Yeah, well, without like getting into a discussion on whether or not genocide is the appropriate term to be using right now, let's be clear that there are war crimes being occurring in Gaza. So not to say I'm in any denial about what's happening there and the horrifying nature of what Palestinians are experiencing. Um, I mean, the hope is that one day there will be peace. And part and parcel of that is reconciliation and being able to make amends on both sides. So it's not just that Israel needs to apologize or make amends for its role in the conflict. The same goes for Palestinians and future Palestinian leadership. And I was actually just thinking about this. So the question is kind of perfect timing. I was thinking about this earlier this morning, that I hope one day that the future president of Palestine will visit the state of Israel and a shrine dedicated to the fallen soldiers and lay a wreath there, as will the future prime minister of the state of Israel visit the state of Palestine and lay a wreath at the memorial site for all Palestinians lost as a result of the conflict. The same thing that we have seen American presidents do in Japan, for example, and vice versa, that even the bitterest of enemies can hopefully one day become strategic partners and not just paper over the dark past. We need to be honest about that, honest about the history of everything. But hopefully we get to a point one day where we can be talking about truth and reconciliation and bring people together. And that's the work that we all have to do at this moment, is hasten that day.
And this also reminds me of Mao's Inon, who is a very famous Israeli peace activist. And on one side, he is there, and on the other side, there is the Palestinian peace activist. So on International Human Rights Day, Palestinian peace activist Isa Amro and Mao Zenon from Israel side, both were honored with Franco-German Human Rights Award. Just, like 3 days back. And that, and Mao's Inon himself has also spoken that how within Israel there's very less space for him and his work to be, even though his parents were killed in the Hamas attack. But the media censorship is there, no space is available for peace activists within Israel. And also one has to talk about Yahya Sinwar. He also killed a lot of Palestinians, the Hamas.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's not just black and white.
Exactly. And I'm happy you mentioned that. It's not just black and white. And, it's very easy. And also in many instances appropriate to be extremely critical of Israel. But I also don't want to be mistaken into being interpreted as only Israel deserves all the blame for the situation that we find ourselves in today, because that's not fair and it's not objective. But yes, it's a difficult moment. Emotions are still raw. There's a lot of trauma that Israelis are facing because of October 7th. And so naturally, they're not necessarily in a position to think about peace, forgiveness, and things of that nature. Not to say I necessarily agree with it, but I can understand that. It's human emotion. But you mentioned people like Mao Zenon and Issa, but also Aziz Abu Sara, who is another Palestinian peace activist who actually works a lot with Mao's. Yeah, and that is the work that needs to be done right now. And it's something that I'm passionate about and do myself on a local level with fellow Israelis and Palestinians. We just had a panel at the Holocaust Museum of LA where a couple of us Jews were in conversation with two Palestinians and just modeling peaceful dialogue, and that's what we need people to see, that there are folks like that, even though the media will always showcase them, that there are folks out there, Israeli and Palestinian, Jewish and Muslim, who are willing to engage in conversation, who understand that our best interests are aligned, and to show people that these conversations are being had, and that we can get to a place where there is that reconciliation that you talked about.
Yeah, and it's very, very so the podcast that we had with Mao Zedong, it actually felt like all of us were in therapy. That was the level of impact that his talk had, and it had a very healing impact, to be honest, even if you are from the region or you're not from the region, because it brought together a lot of things like forgiveness, bitterness, uh, denial, gaslighting, pain, trauma. And we were just listening to him like it was complete therapy session. It was not a podcast. So that was something which was very powerful about the human emotions. Sayani is saying that the narrative, what you're talking about, Jews and Zionism, I think it has been the same experience for Muslims post 9/11, that we are not against Muslims, we are against terrorists in a certain way. The next question that she's asking is, how would you say aspirations for national determination on part of Israel is not reflective of Israel's government policies? Since it's a democratic country, doesn't it reflect a majoritarian view? Also, what do you think of Israel's domestic policies on limiting free speech, like the sanctions and boycott of Haaretz and all of that?
So, reading her question, I think she was responding to how I define Zionism as national self-determination and not being conflated with Israeli government policy.
Yeah.
I think those are two different things, because one was a movement for independence and sovereignty in an ancient homeland, and another thing is government actions. So I think those are unique and mutually exclusive, because what Israel is doing right now, or has been doing since 1948, is not Zionism, because Zionism manifested and was successful and achieved its purpose in 1948. Everything done thereafter by the state of Israel is just government action, just like any other government action and policy taken out by that respective government. What do I think of Israel's domestic policies on limiting free speech? It's worrying, or freedom of expression. It's deeply concerning. I'm very worried about Israel's democracy and respect for freedom of expression, freedom of speech. We saw that the government decided to sanction Haaretz, and that's dangerous. You cannot call yourself a true democracy. And obviously, Israel is not a perfect democracy based on, the way Palestinians are also treated. But you cannot call yourself a serious democracy and trample freedom of expression, even and especially speech that you disagree with. But that is what democracies do. They allow for that speech to be expressed. So it's concerning, and it's something that I wish more people would speak out on, not just in Israel, but also outside of Israel. Israel's allies who care about, what's happening there, including, American Jewish institutions. I would hope, and I sincerely desire that they speak up more about the things that they are seeing, that we are all seeing, that is harmful for Israel's, not just current stability, but future longevity.
And it's no matter how much we keep on critiquing the Israeli government, but I have not seen one government in any country in the world which has taken human rights seriously. Not a single example. Not that I'm justifying.
No, but that's an important point. And I was actually talking about this over dinner last night with a friend of mine. There's so much focus, and that's largely justified on Israel's behavior, right? But at the same time, sometimes it becomes a little bit concerning when people's focus on Israel becomes fixation or obsession, and it results in a double standard insofar as the problems that you are zeroing in on in Israel, you have no qualms when it's being conducted elsewhere. And again, that's not a justification, but it raises eyebrows, right? Because look, racism or discrimination it's not an Israeli idiosyncrasy. And that is a problem that every country has to deal with. And let's also keep in mind, Israel is only, 76 years old? America is 3 times Israel's senior. And look at the racial problems that we still have here today.
Yeah.
Again, not a justification, not an excuse. These things need to change. But I also don't want there to be this hyperfixation and demonization, because the fixation and obsession can lead to demonization, and that becomes dangerous.
And it did, like this fixation and obsession, because when I was a scholar, because we had one particular professor who was so pro-Israel, so blatantly pro-Israel, he never used to answer questions on occupation or human rights, that we made us not only anti-him, but also anti-Israel. And that is not the correct methodology of teaching.
Yeah.
And this is something which I, when I talk to my students, we have to see each other as humans. And also look into what's happening in your country.
Yes.
Before we, just try to understand what's happening in your country and what are the personal issues that you face when you feel that you need to speak out on something.
Yeah.
That's
absolutely.
the same case with a majority of Israelis.
Yeah.
So that is one thing. And teaching was the last thing on his mind, probably. No, he's a very good teacher. He's a very good professor, actually, not a teacher. But if he
seems like he was popular.
He was one of the best, very popular.
I'm being a little sarcastic.
Yeah, but I think that was not the correct way of teaching, because if he would have just been he made us teach about Israel in the human form, along with its various paradoxes. There wouldn't have been so much of animosity against him.
Well, it's you bring up an important point, which is, and this brings me back to dialogue work and trying to reach people and find common ground. When someone realizes that you are so emotionally invested in something, but to the point where it comes off as propaganda, or you're exhibiting over personal bias, it's not reassuring to the person that you are trying to convince, because it actually forces them to raise up their walls and not actually listen to you, because they actually dismiss you for being a propagandist, and that you are not open-minded, you're not exhibiting curiosity, and you're not willing to learn and be corrected. And that's a recipe for failure, especially when you are trying to engage in conversation with somebody that you may not see eye to eye with, but are hoping that you can convince to come to your side of the thing. So I always encourage people to don't come into a conversation as if you are a representative of that country. In other words, be open-minded, be curious, and show a genuine interest in listening to what the other person has to say, instead of feeling like you have to always be armed with the best talking point, or you are you have an agenda, or you need to have strict adherence to message discipline. People see right through that, and that's not a recipe for having allyship or building solidarity.
And to be honest, no matter how much there are many fragments within the Palestinian cause also, right? And specifically, one which really disturbs me is the patriarchy. That's something which I realized only when I went there. But over the period of time, you start seeing the frictions more, like why is the election not happening? Why is there no successor? Why is there so much of corruption? So, all of that is also something that one has to take into point. One cannot defend Hamas in the context of fighting for the Palestinians. One cannot defend what Hamas did. There's no defense of it.
Absolutely.
There's no defense of it. Human being is a human being.
Yes.
So it doesn't matter, it's a way, what I see people getting very fractured on is when they put, again, I'm not patronizing, but even personalities like Yahya Sinwar and others, Just research about him. And we'll get to know about how he was to Palestinians himself.
It's really unfortunate because it stems a lot from, yes, hatred is one element of it, but mostly stems from ignorance and delusion. Because, a lot of that comes from, I have to say, and even, Palestinians I know will say that stems from a Western leftist who are not actually Palestinian, who have no skin in the game, but think that this is a cause that they can latch onto. And for I don't want to be patronizing or condescending here, for good reason. We all want to speak up for Palestinian justice, but too often it gets to a point where it's so maximalist that I need to defend every single thing in the name of Palestine, out of opposition to everything in the name of Israel. But even Palestinians, a lot of, and I can't speak for all of them, but the ones I'm in relationship with don't want anything to be associated with Hamas because it reflects poorly on them.
Yeah.
So the people who are beyond the river and the sea are sometimes more extreme than the people within it. And that's dangerous.
Yes.
It's very dangerous because they feel like, well, we need to, it's this mentality that, if I criticize Palestine or if I in any way demonstrate empathy with Israelis, then I'm being a sellout to the Palestinian cause. But people like Hamas have also oppressed Palestinians themselves. Forget about, if you don't want to acknowledge the oppression or the real harm that Hamas has done to Israelis, well, okay, we can also focus on what they've done to Palestinians themselves.
Yeah. It's like, when October 7 occurred, I asked a Palestinian for his view, and he said, when two elephants fight, it is the grass that suffers.
Mm.
And that was a very, very deep statement. The last question is, Shalaka is asking that what terminology would you use about what is going on in Gaza?
Yeah. Terminology is very important. And I'm somebody that believes deeply in the language that we use because language can kind of shape a conversation, but also derail it. And I'm not going to get into a debate about whether what is happening is genocide because I'm not an international law scholar and I want to leave that to the experts. And there has not been consensus yet on whether Israel is engaging in genocide. We could talk about the impact, what is happening, the reality on the ground, and it is horrific. So I focus on a harm framework. There is a lot of harm being done to Palestinians, just like there is harm being done to Israelis. And I'm not necessarily drawing an equivalence between the two. So I don't focus so much on what term to use. Yes, it's a war. There are war crimes that have been committed. The ICC issued arrest warrants for Netanyahu and Gallant and what is it in absentia, Mohammed Def. So and Yahya Sinwar, I think. Or not Yahya Sinwar. Sorry, not Sinwar. Yeah, just Def. So I focus on the impact and the harm that's being done to people as opposed to fixating on what is the appropriate descriptor of what's happening there.
Yeah. And coming to our last question is that you said that you were very, very inspired by your late grandfather, Dr. Moossa Bral. Can you let us know more about him because we don't know?
Yeah, thank you for asking. So I always, when I introduce myself, I say I'm a descendant of Jews who proudly proclaimed their Jewishness in quasi-tolerant territory, consequences be damned. My paternal grandfather, Moossa, he was a pharmacist by trade, but became the Jewish representative in parliament and the only Jew at his time because of strict Jewish quotas. So he was the representative to the entire Jewish community. And even with the weight of the welfare of the entire Jewish community on his shoulders and the attention that came with being a black sheep, he was unencumbered by the arbitrary limitations imposed on him because of his identity. One of the first things that he did when he entered office was change the law that required all members of parliament to take the oath of office on the Quran to allow all members to take the oath on their holy book of choice. And it was the service of this small but mighty Iranian Jew like myself that was ultimately rewarded by the king, the Shah, Mohammad Reza, with the royal medal, which is, to me, it is that inheritance why I take, as I said, Muslim-Jewish coexistence so personally, even though I'm not naive about its challenges, and why I advocate on behalf of all marginalized communities, not just my own.
And it would have been so, like such a different background to even have nostalgia about, right?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know how much you
Mm-hmm.
remember, but a very different kind of cultural, socio-economic, and that background of that background is a blessing.
Yeah. Thank
I
you.
mean, yeah, I mean, like I just was thinking when you wrote about it, and I was like, how would his grandfather's life be?
Mm.
And what were the challenges? Will we ever come to know about it at that point of time? What were
Mm-hmm.
the internal challenges that he faced? How that passed on from generation? That, today when you speak or identify anywhere, you remember his name.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Yeah, it's a central component of my identity, and always how I introduce myself. My identity is important to me, being the son of Iranian Jewish immigrants, and I take that with me in every space that I'm in.
that is very, and it's the first time that we are able to interact. um, you know um, I don't know how to describe it.
Thank you.
And it was very empowering because, first of all, that you only look like high school guy, and second of all is that, no, it was very, very, because I don't want uh, those who are watching us or the podcast or my students to think in binary.
Hmm.
I don't want to be that professor.
And that's great. And that's I know we're running up on time, but I, we in my work in the presentations I do, obviously I talk so much about dialogue, but within dialogue is the need to push back against binaries and reject binaries, and the
Yes,
idea that you cannot be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, because we've been led to believe since the inception of this conflict that uh, it is inherently incompatible to be both pro-Israel and pro-Palestine, and that's not true. And so we need people to push against those binaries to be able to empathize and humanize both Israelis and Palestinians, because there's no other way around it.
yeah. It's like whenever I tweet more about Netanyahu, my father is like, "Will you stop doing this?" I'm like, I'm like, come on, stop trolling me.
My mom is the same way.
I don't know. So it's the other kind of, era that we live in, but they can
Hmm.
patronize us. They are parents, it's okay. Doesn't matter.
Right. We are our own people.
Yes. So I'm like, so for 2 days I won't, and then I'll start again. So that's the thing. So, because and even with my Israeli friends, I've been very openly that I'm very critical of Netanyahu. That is something which
Yeah,
I've been very vocal to them about, but I'm not critical of you.
exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly. The same here. And I
yeah,
always, I think it's important to remind people that it's okay to criticize government policy, but it crosses the line when you're no longer criticizing policy, you're targeting and criticizing a people and holding them
yes,
collectively responsible.
yes,
And that's a line that we need to keep in mind when we engage in this work, is that keep people centered and center people's humanity. And that's distinguishable from, your criticism of that particular government.
yeah. So thank you so much once again.
Thank you, Doctor. This has been a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me on, and thank you to all your students that are here for your great questions. And I hope to see you all very soon.